Imagine a world where vibrant greenery strikes your eyes the moment you wake. The air you breathe is filtered and refreshing. The technology you use runs on clean energy. Solar panels blend seamlessly into the architecture, while living walls and rooftop gardens surround you. Rainwater is collected instead of wasted, and buildings are covered in plants instead of advertisements. This is the aesthetic of Solarpunk, a social movement that envisions and works towards building a sustainable future interconnected with nature and community. There's just one problem: most of it doesn't exist. So is Solarpunk simply another impossible idealistic internet aesthetic, or could it actually become the blueprint to rebuilding our cities, and maybe even our entire relationship with the planet? In his book, Capitalist Realism, Mark Fisher writes that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Whether or not you agree with his conclusion, his observation about our collective imagination feels incredibly accurate. Over the past few decades, depictions of humanity's seemingly inevitable dystopian collapse have become some of our most influential cultural stories. Movies like I Am Legend and TV shows like The Walking Dead depict a world where virus outbreaks lead to the near extinction of humanity. Video games like Cyberpunk 2077 portray technologically advanced futures defined by dim atmospheres, neon lights, and power-hungry corporations. Part of the reason these stories resonate is because conflict attracts us to stories. A world where everyone was happy and free and stable wouldn't exactly make for the most compelling TV show or video game. But another reason is that they reflect many of our genuine anxieties about the future. Climate change, political instability, and AI automation have made dystopian futures feel like plausible outcomes. So it's no surprise that our culture has become extremely good at imagining collapse. But what if we did something far more difficult and imagined what success looks like? What if we didn't automatically assume that collapse was inevitable? Those are the questions that Solarpunk attempts to answer. The word solarpunk combines solar, representing renewable energy and sustainability, with punk, representing resistance to the status quo. The origins of solarpunk begin with an unassuming blog post from 2008 written by an anonymous blogger, Republic of the Bees, titled From Steampunk to Solarpunk. In the blog post, Republic of Bees describes the design of the Beluga Skysail, a hybrid cargo ship that uses sail power to supplement the ship's engines, resulting in fuel savings between 10 to 35%. So, in honor of the Beluga Skysail's maiden voyage, they write, I'm going to suggest a new literary genre, solarpunk. Unlike steampunk, which imagines an alternate history where Victorian steam technology continued to evolve, solarpunk revolves around a much more practical question. If fossil fuels were no longer cheap or no longer sustainable, what technologies would naturally evolve to replace them? Rather than imagining impossible inventions, Republic of the Bees imagines existing engineering principles pushed to their logical conclusion, combining centuries-old systems with modern ones. That's why the Beluga Skysail became the movement's honorary cargo ship. Instead of abandoning sailing altogether, engineers combined centuries-old wind power with modern navigation systems to reduce fuel consumption. Progress, in other words, is about rediscovering what the past already got right, reintegrating it with present-day advancements, and discarding what clearly isn't working. Republic of the Bees also argued that, unlike most speculative fiction, solarpunk didn't have to remain speculative. Many of its ideas, like renewable energy, passive architecture, wind-assisted shipping, and local food production, already exist in some form. The biggest challenge is intentionally deciding to build a society around them. I actually really like the way the initial solarpunk future was described because, unlike the internet aesthetic that currently dominates the idea, Republic of the Bees assumed that this transition would be difficult. He assumed it would be politically messy, filled with conflicts over energy, economics, and entrenched interests. You know what else is way too difficult to achieve? Finding doctors that actually take your healthcare insurance. I've been putting off a shoulder injury for months because the process of getting help was just way too complicated. I had to search for a doctor on Google that actually takes my insurance and set an appointment and have to wait potentially weeks just to see them. But today's sponsor, ZocDoc, solved that problem. ZocDoc is a platform where you can search and compare local in-network doctors with over 150,000 providers within 200 plus specialties across all 50 states. Their website has tons of reviews from real patients and detailed doctor profiles to help you choose the right one. For my shoulder injury, I needed an orthopedic doctor. So I just searched for an orthopedic consultation for arm and elbow specifically, plugged in my insurance, and ZocDoc showed me all available options in my area and their reviews. From there, it was as simple as making an appointment within the app. Appointments happen fast, usually within 24 to 72 hours, and you can even get same-day appointments. So if you've been putting off an injury like I was, or just a simple doctor's visit because of all the hoops you gotta go through, please prioritize your health and use ZocDoc. It is completely free to use, so if you want to check it out, you can go to ZocDoc.com/Cole or click the first link in the description box below. Solarpunk remained relatively niche for the next several years. Then, in 2012, Brazilian editor Gerson Lodi Ribeiro published the first Solarpunk anthology, Solarpunk, Historias Ecológicas y Fantásticas em un Mundo Sustentável. It was the first serious attempt to turn this loose collection of ideas into an actual body of fiction, imagining sustainable societies that weren't post-apocalyptic or technologically primitive. But Solarpunk didn't really become recognizable until it found a home on the internet. In 2014, artist Olivia Luis published a Tumblr post that would end up defining the movement's visual identity for years to come. Instead of the sterile white minimalism that often dominates futuristic architecture, she imagines something warmer. Art Nouveau-inspired buildings draped in greenery, stained glass solar panels, communal greenhouses, walkable streets lined with independent businesses, handcrafted goods, renewable energy, and technology that felt like it belonged to the natural world. Those illustrations spread rapidly across Tumblr, Pinterest, and later Instagram, eventually becoming the images most people associate with Solarpunk today. The original blog post was primarily concerned with engineering and economics, but then Tumblr gave it an aesthetic language. Neither is inherently more important than the other, but as beautiful images started to spread across the internet, much more than discussions about how to actually build that future, the imagery became more distinct and important than the actual design philosophy that inspired it. So what is the realistic, useful design philosophy of Solarpunk instead of the idealistic aesthetic we typically associate with it? And how close is that aesthetic to practical design? Rather than asking how cities can dominate nature, Solarpunk asks how they can begin behaving more like natural ecosystems, and that idea actually has a name: biomimicry. In short, biomimicry is the replication of the models, systems, and elements of nature for the purpose of solving complex human problems. Janine Benyus, who popularized the field of biomimicry, summarizes it as learning from nature as a model, mentor, and measure. After nearly 3.8 billion years of evolution, nature has become remarkably efficient at regulating temperature, recycling waste, conserving water, and using energy. So biomimicry asks, what if we used nature as our design mentor? Take cooling, for example. Modern buildings typically fight heat by pumping enormous amounts of electricity into air conditioning systems. But what if that building simply didn't get that hot in the first place? This is where passive design enters the picture. Passive cooling relies on architecture itself to regulate temperature before mechanical air conditioning becomes necessary. Building orientation, cross-ventilation, thick walls that slowly absorb heat, shaded windows, overhanging roofs, internal courtyards, and carefully placed vegetation can dramatically reduce cooling demands. And many of these ideas aren't futuristic at all. They've existed for centuries in traditional architecture throughout the Middle East, North Africa, and Southern Europe before cheap fossil fuels made constant air conditioning practical. Now, modern architects are increasingly combining those ancient ideas with contemporary materials and computer modeling. One of my favorite examples I came across was Zimbabwe's Eastgate Center. Inspired by the self-ventilating structure of termite mounds, architect Mick Pierce designed the building to circulate air naturally, significantly reducing the need for conventional air conditioning. This same sort of biomimicry thinking can be applied to any other area of our cities and homes. For instance, transportation is currently one of the most inefficient, unsustainable forms of daily activity that is actively destroying the environment while also unnaturally segregating us from nature due to the sheer lack of walkability. It accounts for roughly 28% of all greenhouse gas emissions. To see a real-world Solarpunk solution to this transportation problem, it's probably best to look at a city that you wouldn't initially consider to be like a Solarpunk aesthetic, but it definitely applies the design philosophy, and that is Copenhagen. Roughly half of all trips to work or school within the city are made by bicycle because the city was intentionally designed to make biking one of the fastest, safest, and most convenient ways to get around. Protected bike lanes are physically separated from traffic, intersections are designed to prioritize cyclists and pedestrians, and an interconnected network of paths makes it possible to travel across much of the city without ever feeling like you're competing with cars. Also, let's talk about trains. One of the reasons trains appears so frequently in solarpunk artwork is because they're one of the most energy efficient ways we've ever invented to move large numbers of people. According to the International Energy Agency, rail carries roughly 7% of the world's passenger travel while producing only about 1% of transport-related emissions. An electrified rail powered by low-carbon energy becomes even more efficient. One of the greatest and probably the most efficient traveling experience I ever had was on Japan's bullet train, also known as the Shinkansen. Since opening in 1964, the network has transported billions of passengers with 0 passenger fatalities from derailments or collisions in commercial service. The trains routinely operate with average delays measured in seconds, not minutes. Now think about how much that sort of reliability changes daily life. Instead of gripping a steering wheel through rush hour and getting pissed at everyone that's trying to pass you, they can read, answer emails, or simply look out the window. The commute becomes much less stressful, which inevitably bleeds over to other areas of your life in a positive way, though Japan isn't necessarily the greatest place to live for natives from what I hear. Next, let's talk about the way that neighborhood zoning is envisioned in a solarpunk world. Urban planners generally define a walkable neighborhood as one where people's daily needs, like food, schools, parks, healthcare, cafes, and public transit, exist within a comfortable walking distance. One of the most influential ideas in modern urban planning is the 15-minute city, the idea that most of your daily needs should be reachable within about a 15-minute walk or bike ride from your home. Mixed-use zoning, where homes, shops, offices, and public spaces exist together rather than being separated into isolated districts, naturally reduces car dependence while creating streets that remain active throughout the day. Research consistently associates walkable neighborhoods with lower transportation emissions, better public health, stronger local businesses, and increased social interaction. That means fewer 15-minute drives just to grab a gallon of milk, more opportunities to run into your neighbors, and public spaces that don't just become empty parking lots after 5 p.m. It turns out that designing cities around people instead of cars makes the city feel more alive too, who would have thought? And in places like Copenhagen, the people themselves seem to be doing pretty well too. Denmark has ranked among the top 3 countries in the World Happiness Report for over a decade, and Copenhagen itself was ranked the world's happiest city in the 2025 Happy City Index. In other words, our behavior follows the city's design, and when the design is in alignment with solarpunk design philosophy, we tend to be happier and healthier. Now, even though many of these principles essential to solarpunk design already exist, there's still a huge piece of the puzzle that's often left out of this discussion: feasibility. I don't think we should just dunk on the concept art and say, this is unrealistic. It's important to have a visual identity behind this sort of movement, and imagining things that may not be super realistic is still important in and of itself, but we should also be asking how much of this stuff can we really build at scale, and what would it take? The problem is that the aesthetic compresses decades of engineering, politics, money, labor, and maintenance into a single beautiful image. For instance, take those pictures of vertical forests. When people imagine solarpunk, they often imagine skyscrapers covered in trees, and the most famous real-world version of this is Bosco Verticale in Milan. The 2 residential towers host around 800 trees, 4,500 shrubs, and 20,000 plants across their facades, essentially turning the building into a kind of vertical ecosystem. On flat land, that amount of vegetation would equal roughly 20,000 square meters of forest and undergrowth. So no, the idea is not impossible, it already exists, but can every skyscraper look like that? Probably not. Because once trees move from the ground to the side of a high-rise building, they cause a whole host of structural, irrigation, safety, and maintenance problems. The balconies have to support the weight of soil, trees, and water. Researchers studying the Bosco Verticale noted that maintaining high-rise vegetation requires careful water management and ongoing data about pruning and automated irrigation. Another thing solarpunk art loves are rooftops covered in gardens, greenhouses, and food production, and again, this isn't complete fantasy. Green roofs can reduce and filter stormwater runoff, provide habitat, absorb pollutants, reduce heat island effects, and add usable green space to dense cities. The EPA notes that green roofs help manage stormwater in cool buildings during warm weather. That is genuinely useful, but can rooftop agriculture feed an entire city? Not remotely. Cities consume too much food, and rooftops have too little space, too many structural limits, and too many competing uses to replace large-scale agriculture. But that doesn't make rooftop farms pointless, it just means that their usefulness is different from the fantasy. They can supplement food systems, reduce heat, manage rainwater, and even create community spaces to reconnect people to the process of growing food. A surface that used to do almost nothing can start doing several useful things at once. That is a very solarpunk idea, but the same limitation appears again with solar panels. Solar panels are probably the most obvious visual symbol of solarpunk. I mean, they're literally in the name. And rooftop solar has enormous potential. One recent analysis estimated that America's rooftop solar potential could generate enough electricity to cover about 45% of US electricity use. That is huge, but notice what that number also means. Even if rooftop solar were fully built out, it still would not cover everything. Cities would still need regional grids. They would still need transmission lines. They would still need storage and backup generation. This is one of the least aesthetic parts of solarpunk, but it's also one of the most important. The International Energy Agency has warned that electricity grids are becoming a bottleneck in clean energy transitions, because renewable energy and electrification can only scale if the grid expands and modernizes alongside them. And honestly, I think nuclear energy belongs in the solarpunk conversation too. That might sound strange in a solarpunk video because nuclear power doesn't have the same soft, leafy aesthetic as solar panels and rooftop gardens. But again, if the real goal is reliable, low-carbon energy, then the conversation can't be limited to what looks good in concept art. A serious clean energy system may involve not just solar and wind, but batteries, geothermal, hydro, and nuclear energy working together. So when people ask whether solarpunk is realistic, I think the most honest answer is that some parts of it are, some parts of it aren't, and the most useful version isn't the image itself, but rather the design philosophy. In terms of what would actually get us closer to these things, there's a few priorities that I just want to list out for you, and I really encourage you to conduct your own research after this video, or even go into these fields like urban planning, like ecology, like agriculture, things where you can make an impact to create a more solarpunk world in the future. And those priorities are zoning laws, transit investment, bike lanes, tree canopies, district heating, better building codes, rooftop solar, faster permitting for clean energy and transmission, repairable products, circular supply chains, and more local agriculture. None of these things are as sexy as a skyscraper covered in waterfalls and fruit trees, but they are much more real. The future will still probably involve the so-called uglier stuff like sewage systems and warehouses and construction workers, power lines, arguments over funding, stuff like that. But if the direction is right, the result could still be a world that feels radically different from the one we inherited. Thank you very much for watching, and if you studied solarpunk for a while and I presented information that wasn't super accurate, or you just want to add something to the conversation, give people resources, whatever, leave a comment. I would love to see these things and to do further research than this video. And if you enjoyed this video, you'll probably like all my video essays on modern issues right here. I always try to provide solutions and hope at the end of the video to get some more autonomy going, realize you can make a change, can make a difference, and that we can see a better future, one that's much better than the dystopia that people usually depict. So I'm now going to go. Goodbye.